Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ACLU of New Jersey's Raising the Bar, the Future of Voting Rights in New Jersey and Beyond. I'm Jean Lo-Cicero. I'm the legal director at the ACLU of New Jersey, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what's become an annual event focused on critical civil rights issues. And this year, we're spotlighting the work to protect and expand equal access to the ballot. The ACLU of New Jersey works to preserve and advance the civil rights and liberties guaranteed to every New Jerseyan by our federal and state constitutions. And we do this through an integrated advocacy model where we're deploying advocacy tools in the courts, in the legislature, and in our communities. And we do all of this alongside impacted community partners and other advocates, some of whom will be part of our panel today. Voting is the cornerstone of our democracy and a foundational right upon which all of our civil liberties rest. And as one of the most diverse states in the country, New Jersey's made real strides in strengthening voting rights and dismantling barriers to the ballot that disproportionately impact communities of color. But as you will soon hear, there is much more work to do. So it's great to have so many of you able to join us to learn more about the landscape of voting rights and how we can engage in these issues. And I'd like to thank our sponsors who've made today's program possible. That includes the Nissenbaum Law Group and our guardian sponsor, Lowenstein Sandler, who is generously providing CLE support for the program, and you'll see some of that information in the chat. Before we jump into the panel discussion, I'm honored that Lieutenant Governor Tahesha Way is able to join us for opening remarks. Lieutenant Governor Way has an impressive biography as a lawyer and a lifelong public servant, and I encourage you to learn more about her background. We invited her today because she has served since 2018 as the Secretary of State and has been responsible for administering New Jersey's elections. By my count, she's in her 7th year, and it's another big year for elections administrators. In addition to managing elections during the pandemic, during her tenure, the Lieutenant Governor and her team have rolled out some really exciting policy reforms that the ACLU of New Jersey and our coalition partners have been working on for years to pass. A few of those key ones include automatic voter registration, online voter registration, in-person early voting, prohibiting prison-based gerrymandering, and one that's near and dear to so many of us, restoring the voting rights for people who are on probation and parole, a barrier that had a disproportionate impact on people of color. Now, candidly, the ACLU of New Jersey and some of our partners have also sued the Secretary of State a couple of times in efforts to protect the rights of voters. And I appreciate that she takes those efforts in stride and that she and her team maintain lines of open communication with advocates as we all work to ensure that elections run smoothly and to protect access to the ballot. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to the Lieutenant Governor, Tahesha Way.
Well, good afternoon to all, and thank you, Jean and the ACLU of New Jersey for hosting this important forum today. Jean, yes, there's been some friendly lawsuits. Let's keep it as that. In my capacity as Secretary of State, I have served as New Jersey's chief election official since 2018, and throughout my more than 6+ years in this role, I have remembered that I'm a member of 2 groups who were excluded from participating in our democracy as voters for most of this country's history. And I know that in places around this nation today, there are folks still trying to restrict voting rights for certain groups or just making it harder to be a voter. So let the record reflect, we are not doing that here in New Jersey. We know that securing our elections, making them free from interference, does not require making voting more difficult. We know that fair elections do not demand that we shrink the electorate by excluding certain categories of people. Here in New Jersey, we have increased access for eligible voters. We've simplified the process to register or update your registration. Any eligible voter can also now register online at vote.nj.gov. Those serving parole or probation are eligible to register to vote as returning members of our communities. And as voters, we have more options. It's easier to sign up to get your ballot in the mail for every single election if that's how you choose to participate. We've implemented the use of hundreds of secure ballot drop boxes across the state to provide voters with another way to conveniently return their ballots. We have 5 days of in-person early voting for the upcoming primary on June 4th and 9 days of it for the upcoming November general election. You can vote at any early voting site in your county. I'm planning on actually in-person early voting on the first day, which is May 29th. And of course, you can always vote on Election Day at your local polling place. There will be 3,200 polling places open on June 4th for the primary. And you can check your location as well as the in-person early voting sites in all things elections, again, at vote.nj.gov. Still, while New Jersey has been doing our part to expand access, there is a looming threat facing voters no matter where we live, and that is misinformation as well as dis and malinformation. Now, no matter the motive behind it, false information about how our elections work is both an ongoing and growing concern. Misinformation undermines voter trust in our democracy and ultimately discourages participation, making it a form of voter suppression. That's actually why we created our New Jersey voter portal in 2020, because we knew at that time that there was a lot of incorrect information out there about changes to our election-related processes due to the pandemic. And we wanted to have an official hub for voters to get all the information they needed, not just to be a voter, but to correct the myths with facts. So I'm not here just to tell you what our state has done well and ask you to make sure you vote. I'm here to challenge you as well-informed, well-educated citizens who were already planning on voting, right? I'm humbly, my friends, asking you to be the person in your community who someone turns to when they have a question about where or how to be a voter. We all have the power and the responsibility to be the trusted voices for voting information within the spaces where we lead. For example, even when I wasn't an election administrator or an elected official, I helped register voters as part of my work as special counsel for my county's Board of Social Services. While clients didn't seek our services for election information, it was still an opportunity to help them become active citizens. So to close, there are always opportunities for us to share our knowledge in a way that lifts up those around us. And if you're still with me and want to answer even one more call to action, just be a poll worker. Every year, thousands of New Jerseyans, maybe even your own family, friends, or neighbors show up and work a long day or a few long hours in service. It's an essential work, and our elections truly would not happen without them. So no matter how you choose to participate in our elections this year and beyond, I want to thank you for joining this panel today and for your interest in protecting the right to vote and the great voters of New Jersey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. We're grateful for all that your office does, and appreciate the concrete information like the dates and especially about your office's efforts to counter voter suppression efforts like disinformation. So thank you for all of that, and appreciate your opening remarks. So now I'd like to turn us over to the panel, and I'll introduce Liza Weisberg, who is an attorney in our office that leads our voting rights and democracy docket, and she'll be handling today's panel discussion. Thanks, Liza.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you to Lieutenant Governor Way, who, as you mentioned, has overseen and implemented a wide range of new voting laws aimed at expanding access to the ballot in her tenure as our Secretary of State, and who has been a really thoughtful partner to advocates all along the way. In fact, just yesterday, in a meeting that her team in the Division of Elections convened with our Election Protection Coalition, she popped in to speak with us, which I know is not something that happens everywhere, or that all secretaries of state make a habit of doing. So I'm so excited to kick off our panel this afternoon. First, let me extend my gratitude to all our panelists for lending their time and expertise to us. They are leading some of the most exciting, urgent, and pioneering voting rights work in New Jersey and across the country. And I just couldn't be more thrilled to have them assembled together here. I could spend the remainder of our time just reading their bios. They're very full and fascinating. But instead, I'll commend everyone to the CLE materials, which include those bios, and jump right in. So we're going to start with a question for each panelist and then open up the conversation. And then we'll end at the end with a Q&A. So please view your questions using the Q&A function as we go, and we'll get to them at the end. For those of you earning CLE credit, I'll announce 3 codes that you'll need to select for your affirmation survey, and we'll share them in the chat as well. And you'll be able to earn 1.8 New Jersey CLE credits and 1.5 New York credits, I believe. So on that note, the first CLE code is 186672. So I'll say it again, 186672, and we'll add that to the chat as well. But now on to the real event. We'll start first with Sophia Lynn Lake, who's the director of the National ACLU's Voting Rights Project. Sophia, the Federal Voting Rights Act has suffered a few major blows in the last dozen years. Could you take us briefly through the history of the VRA, its significance, its recent erosion, and how you and your team are approaching litigation under the VRA now?
I will try to be as quick as possible and brief, but the history is fascinating, I think important one. But first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion and for holding this important discussion right now. It's obviously a critical moment when it comes to protecting voting rights and safeguarding our elections. So thank you so much again for all of the participants and for all of you for showing up. Just very quickly, for those who aren't familiar with the Voting Rights Project at the ACLU, we were founded in 1965, the same year that the Landmark Voting Rights Act was passed. We've brought over 400 cases protecting and advancing voting rights in that time, and including 11 statewide redistricting cases that we're litigating right now. We brought over 30 cases in the lead up to the 2020 election to protect voters and safeguard accessible voting options in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have ongoing cases challenging anti-voter laws across the country. But to the question, in order to really put the history of the Voting Rights Act into context, I think it's important to highlight two basic ideas or themes when it comes to the historical arc of voting rights that I think it's important to keep in mind in this particular moment, especially. First, throughout our nation's history, race has played a central role in how we define ourselves as a political community. It's demarcated lines of citizenship and govern how we allocate the right to vote. And the second one is that history is not one of linear progress. You may have heard this in Story of Civil Rights. We've obviously seen tremendous progress, but the forces of reaction have ensured that every success of democratic expansion in our history has been met with a countervailing period of contraction and retrenchment. That history continues today and provides, I think, the necessary context for understanding this moment. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time, not to our founding, but to the aftermath of the Civil War, which is another critical moment of democratic expansion in this country and gave us the Reconstruction Amendments. I think it's important because it's not many people realize that following these amendments, almost immediately, hundreds of former slaves throughout the South were elected to Congress. Half of the state legislatures in the South were extraordinarily diverse. We have half of South Carolina's legislatures were former slaves, 42% of Louisiana's state house was, 30% of Mississippi's, hundreds of African Americans were elected to statewide and local offices. But there was, like I said, an immediate backlash. We have states adopting the classic Jim Crow test, the literacy test and the like. We see the rise of Jim Crow in other parts of daily lives. And that the effect was devastating and almost immediate. In the former Confederate states, nearly all Black citizens were disenfranchised and removed by 1910. Louisiana registration, Black registration numbers dropped from 44.8% in 1894 to just 4% in 1900. By 1940, just 3% of eligible Black voters in the South are registered to vote. This is how things largely stood for decades. There was essentially no change on voting in the South. We've got various civil rights laws that were passed, but really nothing could stop voting discrimination because the tactics were constantly changing. And you were finding yourself constantly chasing every new tactic. Each time you struck one down, one would pop up. The catalyst finally for real change was Selma, the climax of the civil rights movement. The murders of voting rights activists and other acts of violence and terrorism had been building, and the brutality really gained national attention. Ultimately, the turning point was the unprovoked attack by state troopers on peaceful marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, en route to the state capitol in March of 1965. Marchers were brutally beaten, they lost their lives, and these events finally persuaded President Johnson and Congress to overcome Southern legislators' resistance to really effective voting rights legislation. And finally, we get what is known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And there was immediate progress. Registration rates skyrocketed. Before the Voting Rights Act in Alabama, Black registration rates was 19%, Mississippi is 6%. Within 5 years, these rates were about 50%. Thousands of discriminatory voting practices were blocked or successfully challenged under the Voting Rights Act. And since that time, the 4 decades that followed, while things haven't been perfect, there was, I would say, a general consensus that voting should be easy and accessible, that everyone should be treated fairly in the process. And it gave us decades of forward movement as a country on voting rights. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, whose I think the central provision that's been so important is the so-called pre-clearance regime. And this is the provision that prevented racially discriminatory voting practices from going into effect at all. They had to be pre-cleared by the federal government before they could go into effect. And that meant before they could take root in a community. And that was the central provision. After that, in 1982, we have the amendments to the Voting Rights Act, which gave us some of the strongest voting rights protections against voter discrimination by race that we had ever seen. In 1993, Bill Clinton signed the National Voter Registration Act, which expanded dramatically registration opportunities across the country. In 2006, President Bush reauthorized the VRA for another 25 years with the Senate vote of 98-0. And we have massive diversification of the electorate. And ultimately, progress continues until we see the voters of color, young voters, really flexing their political muscle and turning out in record numbers to elect this country's first Black president in 2008. But almost immediately, we start hearing this sort of steady drumbeat that, this can't be right. There must be something wrong. Should we be making it easier for people to vote? We should make it harder. And in 2019, we've got 19 states, 2020, we have 19 states passed 25 laws that made it harder for people to register to vote or cast a ballot. And many of these laws were initially blocked in court or during the 2012 election under that pre-clearance regime that I talked to before, which is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. But then comes the Shelby County decision from the United States Supreme Court, and that rendered this particular provision, the central provision, essentially defunct. And immediately unleashed a wave of voter suppression efforts that we had not seen in generations. And if anything, things have intensified and have gotten even more difficult for us as voting rights advocates to challenge and ensure that voters have access to the polls and don't suffer from racial discrimination. Shelby County left in place the so-called Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the nationwide permanent ban on racial discrimination. But this provision itself, to Liza's question about continuing erosion of the Voting Rights Act itself, has been under attack in recent years. We have a case from 2021, the Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee case, which really ratcheted up what voting rights plaintiffs need to do to prove to challenge these kinds of voter suppression tactics on the right to vote in court, and at the same time made it ratcheted down really what the state needs to do in order to justify those restrictions. We have percolating in the circuit courts this idea that despite 60 years of precedent on this score, that private plaintiffs, private individuals, voters themselves are not allowed to actually bring a case themselves to court to vindicate their rights under Section 2. And there are a number of other attacks making their way through the federal courts right now on the constitutionality, the scope, the evidentiary requirements of making out a Section 2 claim, and also claims under other protective provisions of the Voting Rights Acts. So we shall see what will happen, but the aim of many of these attacks is to really narrow Section 2's application to only the most egregious cases of racial discrimination, if not ultimately to gut it entirely. There are some bright spots, of course, that to show that even with these risks, it's still worth fighting and using the tools that we have. Even if you spend more time picking your cases and developing them, deciding which ones to press, which ones not to, and we've had, and it's shown, we've had some success, including a huge win in the redistricting context out of Alabama in the Allen versus Milligan case that the ACLU and the LDF brought along with other partners just recently. So there are some bright spots where we understand it's no secret that the courts are not a friendly place to be right now, but I think the lesson that I sort of put in terms of how we're approaching this is that there are still places to fight, there are still tangible wins to be had, and that you're only going to do that if you have skin in the game. So picking your cases wisely in the face of this erosion of our federal protections of voting rights, including the VRA, is a big piece of it. Sorry, that was a lot. I hope, please forgive me for that, but I think the whole history is quite interesting and important.
Thank you so much. We're going to be sure to highlight the bright spots as we go today. So thanks for setting us out on that path. And also highlight the places where we're continuing to fight. So next, a question for Karen Short, who's the Director of Legal and Research for the League of Women Voters of the United States. Karen, can you talk about some of the practical implications of these erosions of federal protections that Sophia mentioned, sort of what the trends you're seeing nationally in voter suppression and dilution tactics are looking like, and maybe also just sort of how advocates are adapting and what sort of claims and tactics and strategies they're increasingly turning to in light of this wave of voter suppression tactics and the erosion of the federal VRA.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for inviting me, Liza. This is so exciting to be with so many of you and such great colleagues in this fight. So the League of Women Voters engages in state and federal litigation to defend democracy and empower voters. That's our mission. These are happening across the country. And so we are seeing lots of trends, especially with the erosion of the Voting Rights Act, as Sophia mentioned. So as an initial matter, the loss of a working Section 5, as Sophia was describing, has done considerable damage to access to the ballot in the states previously covered by Section 5. These are mostly in the Deep South. This is where I am. I live in Atlanta. So I'm seeing these things, firsthand. In particular, the harm from these laws that are being passed, as Sophia was mentioning, disproportionately impact Black voters and other voters of color. For example, the day Shelby County was decided and the days following, previously covered states passed or implemented laws that they had chosen specifically not to seek preclearance for. While Section 5 was in place, they were essentially waiting for the day that it was no longer required, because they knew that these laws they were passing, photo ID laws, other restrictive laws, would not have been pre-cleared, most likely. And as Sophia already mentioned, dozens of anti-voter laws have been proposed and passed in the 10 years since we have lost Section 5 protection. The sheer volume of these harmful anti-voter laws, policies, and procedures that are implemented without any federal oversight causes great strain on voting rights attorneys, advocates, plaintiffs. Although it seems like there are a lot of us voting rights lawyers, there aren't nearly enough to tackle every actionable claim that we find. Simply not even close. And so this has been one of the huge devastating impacts of losing the active Section 5. We used to only need to challenge the laws that Section 5 didn't prevent or block. Now we're fighting everything. We have to fight everything. So some of the trends we're seeing across the country, a big one is laws targeting absentee ballot access, especially in the wake of the 2020 election, where so many people used absentee ballots and mail voting to successfully vote. Legislatures, here's that backlash. They're coming back and saying, oh, we're not sure we like all these people voting for some reason. And they're imposing various barriers to the absentee ballot process to make it harder to vote every step of the way. A big example we're seeing right now is placing restrictions on who can assist someone, a voter who requires assistance, a voter with a disability. These laws are in direct contradiction to Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. And we have a number of suits right now to challenge these laws around the country, and not just in the Deep South. We're also seeing many attempts to make the work of third-party voter services organizations like the League of Women Voters harder or impossible to conduct. In Florida, for example, SB 7050 was signed recently that imposes really high fines on organizations if they use people with felony convictions or non-citizens to help register voters. These fines are $50,000 for each violation. And so to prevent that, you have to, what do? Get a background check. Those are very expensive. So in the wake of that law, our Florida League of Women Voters had to suspend its voter registration efforts, which is a huge blow because they do register a lot of voters in the state of Florida. That, thankfully, part of that law has now been enjoined, the non-citizen provision, but it is on appeal. Other trends we're seeing, laws that make it easier to challenge a voter's eligibility and attempts to purge voters who are legally on the registration rolls. Laws to challenge the integrity of the election system, including laws that make it harder for election officials to do their jobs and make it easier for anyone to challenge the outcome of an election. Finally, AI is becoming artificial intelligence is becoming a tool for voter suppression. We're seeing private groups use AI to confuse and intimidate voters. But we have many tools to challenge these provisions, in addition to what is left, which is a lot, of the Voting Rights Act, to challenge laws that dilute or deny the vote of Black voters and other voters of color. We're also using other statutes that we have to protect voters. Within the VRA, we're using provisions like Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act, which protects against voter intimidation, and Section 208, as I mentioned, which protects voters with disabilities. We're also looking at the National Voter Registration Act, which protects voters from unlawful removal from the registration rolls, bringing affirmative NVRA litigation, also using the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that voters with disabilities have the same access to the voting process as voters without disabilities. These laws typically disproportionately impact voters of color as well. So this is also directly addressing the racial inequities in voting. And finally, our good old Constitution, the first, 14th, 15th Amendments provide a number of claims we can bring to challenge laws that place undue burdens on voters, laws that intentionally discriminate against Black voters and other voters of color, and laws that harm of voters and voting rights organizations' right to association and free speech. So we're finding success with these claims, but as Sophia mentioned, it depends on where you're filing. It depends on your judge. We have a lot of hostile judges to voting rights, unfortunately. But that means we just fight harder. We are carefully selecting our cases, and we continue to bring claims to enforce all these federal protections that were so hard fought and hard won to protect voters and democracy itself. And we'll keep fighting.
Next up, Michael Pernick, who is redistricting counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. Michael, so Karen mentioned a lot of new tools that advocates are turning to sort of overcome the gaps in protections left by the gutting of Section 5 and erosion of Section 2 of the VRA. And I want to mention another new and really exciting tool, which is state level voting rights acts. Can you tell us what state VRAs are, why they're important, and what's in store for New Jersey?
Absolutely. So first, Liza, I want to thank you and ACLU of New Jersey for convening this event, and I'm really grateful for your leadership pulling together this incredible panel. It's a real honor to be here with these amazing voting rights leaders. And I do want to apologize at the outset for being the ruining what would otherwise be an amazing all-women panel. So I hope you'll forgive my inclusion and messing that up for everybody. As background, my organization, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. LDF is America's premier racial justice legal organization, and we use litigation, advocacy, and public education to achieve racial justice. My work at LDF focuses on voting rights. I litigate voting rights cases, including some important work a couple of years ago in Louisiana with our esteemed moderator, Liza, before she joined ACLU. And over the last couple of years, I've really been focused on developing and designing and advocating for state-level voting rights acts across the country. As Sophia and Karen discussed, the federal VRA has suffered some significant challenges in recent years. Obviously, we talked about Shelby County effectively ending the preclearance provisions that prevented racially discriminatory changes from going into effect in the first place. And the wave of voter suppression legislation that Karen powerfully walked through and detailed, it's become more challenging in the last few years to litigate voter suppression in light of this 2021 opinion, Brnovich v. DNC, that hampered the ability to use Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act to challenge what are called vote denial provisions or voter suppression. And even though there have been some crucial successes challenging racially discriminatory districting plans that Sophia talked about, including the important win and landmark Supreme Court opinion in Milligan, reaffirming the constitutionality and vibrancy of Section 2 to challenge redistricting and vote dilution that can be racially discriminatory. It's still the truth that these claims are very challenging to bring and impose high costs on organizations and plaintiffs. The litigation under Section 2 is extremely complex, and there are challenges and uncertain footing in certain contexts and circuits that Sophia addressed. So state VRAs have become an increasingly popular and important tool to correct this erosion of certain aspects of the federal VRA by codifying at the state level similar but strengthened protections against racial discrimination in voting. Many of the protections in state VRAs, they are similar to provisions of the federal VRA, but they're updated and expanded and bolstered based on the decades of experience that lawyers in this group and other organizations have litigating under the federal VRA. There are currently 7 states that have adopted state VRAs: California, Washington, Oregon, Virginia, New York, Connecticut, and just last week, the governor of Minnesota signed the Minnesota Voting Rights Act into law. So we've seen this expansion in interest in state VRAs. Since 2018, a state VRA has passed every single year. A new state has adopted a state VRA, except for 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. But every single year since 18, other than 2020, we've seen a new state take the step to enshrine some of the protections that we should have under the federal VRA and we should have in federal law into state law. The most comprehensive state VRA model contains really 6 main tools. The first is a state-level private right of action that is analogous to Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, but expanded and bolstered and streamlined in certain ways to make it easier and less costly and more predictable for voters of color to have their rights protected. With respect to vote dilution, these new private rights of action provide a new tool to combat racially discriminatory redistricting plans or at-large elections that might shut out voters of color from having any voice in their local government. It provides new tools to challenge voter suppression. In fact, the version of the state VRA, the voter suppression protection that literally just passed in Minnesota last week, has provisions that explicitly walk through some of the problematic and misguided benchmarks in the 2021 Brnovich opinion that I mentioned, and said, actually, we're going to reject these benchmarks and instead focus on the heart of this inquiry, which is whether the challenged act or practice is harmful, has a harmful effect on voters of color. So these new tools streamline litigation. They make these claims more predictable. They make them less expensive because you don't need to satisfy all of the elements that are required under federal law. And it reverses some of the ways in which federal cases have restricted and limited the availability of Section 2. State VRAs have also included what we call the notice and safe harbor provision, which incentivize out-of-court resolution. As Karen said, there simply aren't enough lawyers to go around to challenge every discriminatory structure at the local level in every single state. And that's why state VRAs really have these procedures to incentivize out-of-court resolution without costly and extended and prolonged litigation, to make it easier to eliminate racial discrimination at the local level wherever it appears. So that's the first big section, and those provisions have been included in some part, in total, or in part in all of the state VRAs that have been adopted. Second, state VRAs can enshrine pre-clearance into state law so that local governments with a history of racial discrimination in voting would be required to get pre-approval from the state before making any changes to their voting rules. State VRAs identify the jurisdictions that would be subject to this requirement in a number of ways. Obviously, if a jurisdiction violates a voting rule, violates the federal VRA or the state VRA, that would be an important reason to cover that jurisdiction for a state-level pre-clearance program. But some states are also experimenting with using other forms of disparities, racial disparities in voter turnout, racial disparities in arrest rates, could all be a basis, depending on how the VRA is designed, to apply this pre-clearance framework to a local jurisdiction to require that locality to get pre-approval before they can close down a polling place or adopt a new redistricting plan, just to make sure that those changes don't harm voters of color. Third, we see state VRAs expanding language access. Under Section 203 of the federal VRA, there's an obligation that certain jurisdictions provide translation. The federal law applies this requirement to any jurisdiction with at least 10,000 citizens of voting age, or 5% of the total population that don't speak English well, are required to provide translation for certain languages. State VRAs in 2 states so far have provided the same obligation, but with much lower thresholds to cover a much broader universe of local governments, so that even if it's only 2 or 3% of the population, there would still be an obligation to provide translation to make sure that everybody has the information they need to be able to vote. Fourth, state VRAs are enshrining new protections against voter intimidation, deception, and obstruction. These are really important supplements to the existing federal statutes to provide clearer tools, clearer legal standards. We don't see as much voter intimidation litigation as we do vote dilution, and this would really provide tools to supplement what we have in federal law, enable punitive damages to disincentivize bad actors from engaging in repeat conduct, facilitate injunctive relief so that if there's an organization that's engaging in intimidating conduct, courts would be authorized and empowered and entitled to step in. Next, state VRAs are enshrining what's called the democracy canon, a rule to direct courts to construe laws in a manner that's pro-voter, pro-democracy. Minnesota's state VRA adopted last week actually expanded this to direct courts to exercise their discretion in all regards, including discovery and remedies in a pro-democracy, pro-voter fashion. And finally, we see state VRAs enshrining a database of election data into state law to collect all of the information that's necessary to understand electoral practices, to evaluate potential violations, and to help jurisdictions comply with the law. And we've seen a number of states enshrine these state databases into state law. So you've heard a lot about the threats to the right to vote from Karen and Sophia, and I touched on them a little bit as well. But there is hope, and there is this potential new tool to enshrine robust protections at the state level. There's a lot of interest in state VRAs, and there's an exciting campaign here in New Jersey that's being led by the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice. We'll hear from Henel shortly, and ACLU New Jersey. Liza's been instrumental in this effort. So it's very exciting to see legislation advancing here in New Jersey and a number of other states to try to bring these protections into state law. So happy to continue the conversation, and I'll pass it back to you, Liza, with that.
Thank you so much, Michael. Next up, Yael Bromberg is a constitutional rights attorney and principal of Bromberg Law LLC, and a leader in voting rights litigation here in New Jersey. And Michael helped us sort of begin to zoom in on New Jersey. And of course, no conversation about democracy in New Jersey would be complete without mentioning the county line. So Yael, could you tell us what the county line is, the claims that you've raised in your lawsuits challenging the county line, and where that litigation is today?
Sure, Liza, and thank you for having me. I'm a longtime fan and friend of ACLU of New Jersey, and it's really a privilege to be able to join my co-panelists on the national and the state stage to discuss the vision for voting rights in New Jersey and beyond. When I often tell the story that when I moved to DC 10 years ago, people said, "Why are you so passionate about democracy and voting rights?" And when I told them I'm from New Jersey, they just kind of gave me a knowing nod. And it's taken me a long time to really fully embrace and understand what that means for New Jersey, which is typically considered a blue state, but is really a little bit purplish, especially on the local level, but even going on to the statewide level. And so New Jersey has this very kind of unique history in terms of when it chooses to embrace democracy and when it chooses not to. And it's very loud when it chooses not to. And we're seeing current examples of that before I get into the specifics of the county line case. But the current examples of that give us a signal of what we're seeing with regard to the response to the county line case. So last legislative term, we saw the evisceration of campaign finance reform in New Jersey, which we're currently experiencing the effects of. This legislative term, of course, we see the proposed rollbacks to the Open Public Records Act, which is currently awaiting response by Governor Murphy. It's a very radical response by a blue state to access to basic transparency. And of course, we see the continued resistance to the availability of same-day registration, which is a common sense measure that's available across the nation, even in some red states, but in New Jersey, we can't get it to see the light of day. And it becomes very loud because we just expect better from our Democratic Party leadership. In that way, these issues are not about really partisanship, but they're about basic democracy, expanding access, a robust vision for rights, including voting rights in New Jersey, and just the fact that we know better. We know better about election modernization and expansion, and we should do better. That brings us to the current effort to maintain power and control of the ballot by party insiders so that they can decide who gets a significant electoral advantage or disadvantage based on the ballot design rather than letting the voters decide. The county line is a ballot design used uniquely in New Jersey primary elections, and it literally creates a line down the ballots for candidates running from highest to lowest office. As a voting rights professor, I think of it, when I look at it visually, it looks like a gerrymander. The ballot is essentially gerrymandered. It treats similarly situated candidates running for the same office unequally by giving preferential ballot treatment to some over others, and it forces association and gamesmanship for best position on the ballot. That, in effect, fosters a culture in New Jersey of soft corruption and deal making in the state. And importantly, it excludes diverse voices, including new voices, from entering the fray. And it disincentivizes elected officials from voting in the public's best interest because they're worried about whether or not they'll be able to get the county line again the next time they run. It's frankly a national embarrassment, and we even have to continue to fight for it. Most recently, we brought the case originally about 4 years ago on behalf of New Jersey working families and a slew of candidates across the state. And then we brought a new, my legal team and I, it's a 3-member legal team, brought a new lawsuit on behalf of Andy Kim and 2 congressional candidates. Heading into the upcoming primary, which is in only 13 days. So this is a call for everyone to vote, to make sure that your voter registration is accurate in New Jersey and to get your peers and colleagues to vote. The primary election is so critical, especially in a state like New Jersey, where once you get to the general election, especially for certain races, the outcome is largely decided. The real fight for certain races in New Jersey is the primary ballot. So we filed a lawsuit seeking preliminary relief for the upcoming primary, which all voting rights litigators know that's a very high bar to have to achieve. You have to contend with certain doctrines and principles like the Purcell Doctrine. They argued that the voting machines could not support office block ballot designs in New Jersey. So this became like a nerd fest, basically, at least for me, with regard to what the voting machines can and can't do, and the impact of them. And this is really ironic, actually, in New Jersey, right? We have a robust state constitution that allows for expansive protections, more so than on the federal standard. So now that we're seeing these restrictions, so despite the bright lights in the federal judiciary, on the state level, we have more expansive interpretations of the right for free suffrage, the right for free speech and association, equal protection rights, and rights related to the criminal justice system. And in New Jersey, we should really be embracing that rather than resisting it. And we can certainly learn from our recent past. In 2020, New Jersey boasted the national highest rate in youth voter participation of 67%. And that was due to its embrace, and thank you to our opening remarks speaker, because that was due to the expansion of vote by mail mechanisms, which we've since seen the rollback of. And so my vision, Liza, of where we can go, because the panel is really about the future of voting rights in New Jersey and beyond, is this embrace of election modernization and democratic inclusion. We have online voter registration, we have automatic voter registration and in-person voting in the state, but we can do so much better. We need same-day registration, we need universal postage for prepaid vote by mail ballots. We do have pre-registration at 17. We need to lower that to 16. We need to support the State Voting Rights Act and the effort that Hennel is leading, as well as many other leaders across the state, for which we'll be speaking about soon with regard to access for youth voters to participate in the school board races. And we need we need them to stop. I have my sick boy is home for school. I'll find it soon, baby. his chessboard. What was very interesting in the fight for the county line was that the county clerks ended up folding. And we went on appeal to the Third Circuit, and a unanimous precedential decision was reached, finding that the county line should be implemented for the upcoming election. The perversity is that the lawsuit continues to be litigated, that there's a denial that this achievement of preliminary relief so that everyone can vote and run for office with an office block ballot is not guaranteed for permanent relief. And that this is being done on the taxpayer dime is just absurd. The writing is on the wall of where we're going. New Jersey is the outlier in the nation with regard to the way in which the ballot design is offered. And I was reflecting on the remarks by my colleague Sophia with regard to the first and second Reconstruction. A lot of folks believe that we may be in the midst of a third Reconstruction, right? When we experienced the first and second Reconstruction, we saw the constriction of rights and the expansion of new rights following political and physical violence, right? So we have this violence accompanied by robust expansion. That tension, unfortunately, is the way that we've learned to allow for that expansion to begin, right? So first Reconstruction era, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, second Reconstruction, 24th, 25th, and 26th Amendments come through, and the manifestation of the rights of previous amendments that were ratified. And so the question is, what are we going to have with regard to the current Reconstruction? Those efforts are created by party insiders that want to maintain power and control, just like we're seeing in New Jersey today. And I'll end with this, is there's this great visual of what happened in the midst of the litigation when one of the United States senatorial candidates, Patricia Campos Medina, was physically blocked from entering the county party Democratic convention. That's physical violence. Did they touch her? No, but they physically blocked her from entering, accompanied by the political violence of their continued defense of a system that we know to be wrong, that the state attorney general has written that he will no longer defend this unjust law. And so my vision for New Jersey is one in which we embrace common sense modernization and democracy, and that includes voting and all of the orbit of accompanying rights, including access to transparency, the resistance of the current evisceration for OPRA, the Open Public Records Act, and so much more. We can do so much more, and we could be a national leader if we want to. So thank you, Liza, for the opportunity to talk about the county line case and New Jersey in the national stage.
Thank you so much, Al. I think maybe the only thing more impressive than you and your 3-person legal team taking on the county line and the party boss machinery in New Jersey and this massively anti-democratic primary ballot system is that your sick kid wants a chessboard. So kudos to you. You helped us start to think about future in New Jersey and what New Jersey could look like in the coming decades with a full embrace of voting rights. And so I want to turn next to Henel Patel to help us continue that conversation. Henel is the law and policy director of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Henel, could you tell us about some campaigns taking shape at the local or state level that make you optimistic about the democracy landscape in New Jersey, and perhaps starting, as Yael hinted, with the movement to lower the voting age in municipal or school board elections?
Absolutely. I'm going to echo, okay. Hopefully my Wi-Fi holds up. I apologize, folks. I'm at a conference, and so this is hotel Wi-Fi. Bear with me if I freeze. So I want to also echo some of my co-panelists. Thank you, Liza, and the ACLU for bringing us together. This is such a great panel, and it's an honor for me to be here. And to touch on something both Karen and Michael said. One, there aren't a lot of election law and voting law lawyers in the country, honestly, and even and especially in New Jersey. And to Michael's point, it is actually the vast majority of this bar is men, so it's actually not easy to bring together a panel that's mostly women. So I really do want to commend the ACLU for doing this. and appreciating Michael's presence here and his amazing partnership and knowledge. But it is, I think a lot of us have been in rooms where we're maybe the only woman or one of two in when there's like 15 men lawyers. So it's not easy. But thank you to bring us together. So thank you. It is, I'm going to touch on something Sophia was getting into, the history of voting rights in this country. I also want to highlight a little bit of how that's reflected and plays out in New Jersey. So it's funny, we often say at the Institute that New Jersey benefits from this halo, this false halo of progressivism. Folks think we're something we're not quite. We're and Yael touched on this too, is I go back. So I've been at the Institute and it's an honor to be here. So if you're not familiar, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, we are a racial advocacy organization here in New Jersey, a racial justice organization. And we work across 3 different pillars, economic justice, criminal justice reform, and democracy and justice. And in this program, our goal is to try to build a real multiracial democracy here in New Jersey that actually reflects the population. And the highlight of that is the focus is to make sure the most marginalized voices are at the table. And I've been fortunate to be able to do this work, both leading campaigns, but also working in partnership with so many folks here. And also imagine for you folks turning in, we have this amazing advocacy space in New Jersey. And often we are combating views of what people think New Jersey is and what it actually is. I go back, so I've been at the Institute for about 5 years. And my whole first year, so it was 2019. And we were working on this campaign to restore voting rights. And I would get phone calls. I get people in New Jersey. This was the Trump era. The 2018 midterms had just happened, and folks, really passionate folks, would reach out and go, hey, is there things we can do to work on voter suppression in other states? Did you see what happened in Georgia in the 2018 election? And it's absolutely true. It's really relevant. It's relevant, and I completely understand the desire and want to help because folks do face some terrible voter suppression, as Sophia and Karen were discussing. But I kept pointing out that at that time, I was like, look, I hear you. You are absolutely right. But you do know that Georgia has early voting and New Jersey doesn't. Early in-person voting. We just didn't have it. I was like, there is a lot we have to do here. We just think we're okay. And that's the thing we have to combat against sometimes, that folks think we're in a different place. And I think that's from historically in New Jersey. So New Jersey, to Sophia's history lesson, in our first constitution, New Jersey, 1776, we are one of the first states of the original colonies, and with all that implies, New Jersey had some of the broadest voting rights in the country. While it was tied to property, fortunately, that was the only restriction. So in New Jersey, free Black men were able to vote. In New Jersey, some women, those who were allowed to own property, who were mostly widows, but they were allowed to vote. In New Jersey, you didn't have to be a citizen to vote. And that's actually the case for a lot of states. Citizenship requirements started up when the demographics of immigrants changed throughout history, and align a little bit with the felony disenfranchisement movement that Sophia was discussing. So that is where we started in New Jersey, one of the broadest voting rights in the country at that time. And since then, it's been just for almost 200 years, just chipping away at that. Very quickly, voting rights were limited to white men for purely political reasons. They came into power and said, hey, these very few women are voting for another party. Let's restrict it. And that's kind of what we saw through history till in 1844, they limited the franchise to white men only into our Constitution. It was also when they first tied the right to vote to our criminal justice system. And we've been fighting that back since. So we are here now. And if you looked at New Jersey about 10 years ago, New Jersey was, I don't know, in the grand scope of this country, I'd probably give us about a B- in voting rights. It wasn't terrible. There's certainly places who are dealing with or dealing with worse, but it was hardly great. We have, for example, at that time, anyone with a criminal conviction who is currently in prison, who was on parole and probation, could not vote. That movement started in 1844 and continued despite legal cases. You can look them up. Stevens v. Yeaman in 1970, which initially it was a federal case that found that the crimes that New Jersey had denied the right to vote for were completely arbitrary. The response to that, because it was a mass incarceration era, was just to make every crime one that you are disenfranchised for. There was a move in about 20 years ago, NAACP state conference versus Harvey, to try to address it. But the reality is, and we do have a robust New Jersey Constitution, but there are limitations with what we can do under the law through litigation, unfortunately, and some things have to be done through legislation. And we were in a little bit of a standstill. We have a lot of polling places in New Jersey. That is, I often consider it one of the highlights of our voting system, our democracies in New Jersey, that you can go. There are, if you live here, you know this. Your polling places probably in your neighborhood. If not walking distance, somewhat close enough. We do not have to drive a half an hour, 45 minutes as folks do in other states to go vote, which also means that often, though not always, you don't have a long wait when you go vote because we have so many polling places. Thebut on the flip side, we didn't have a lot of other things. We just now have early in-person voting. We did expand vote by mail. There's been a long process now in the last about 15 years to slowly expand vote by mail, which is tremendous. We do not have same-day voter registration yet, despite many efforts. We do have a campaign. If anyone's curious, Democracy in a Day, please reach out. And want to help. But it is constantly up against political issues. And that's what it comes down to. Every single thing in voting rights comes down to politics, because voting is power. We know that. We know it's so important. The reason we urge voters to vote is because it's their power, but the people in power also know that. It always comes down to, these people might vote and influence how this is going to affect the outcome of an election. I've had discussions on same-day voter registration where people will tell me, elected officials will say the reason we can't have it is because they're afraid of how college students may impact a race. Right here in New Jersey, blue state. And what you do with that is you keep fighting. But this is the reality, is that people don't expect that from elected officials in a blue state. They won't be surprised if you hear that from someone in Alabama. But they are here, and that's also a privilege that elected officials benefit from. They're not people aren't looking to them. They're not looking and with skepticism on what they're doing on democracy. It's why they can do so much that is problematic. It's why we've had this terrible county line system, this incredibly anti-democratic county line system for so long, and took years of litigation from Yael and her team to actually work to abolish it. We're not quite there yet, but close. So which is really exciting. They could have at any given time just passed the law fixing our ballot design. They just don't, because it comes down to power. At any given time, we could have same-day voter registration, but we don't. So these are things that prevent us from becoming leaders. But the work we do, unfortunately, when you talk to people in New Jersey, there's an excitement. People want more. People here believe in democracy. People here believe in it. This is why Yael mentioned this terrible Oprah bill. it's unpopular. 81% of people in New Jersey oppose it because people here, I think, really do understand and appreciate democracy. So how do we coalesce and harness that power to bring us back and further than where we once were? Once upon a time, New Jersey was a leader in voting rights in this country. And I think a lot of the work we try to do is get us back to that. So yes, it's getting us to passing laws that other states have already done. So same-day voter registration, but also we want a strong, robust we want the strongest voting rights act in the country right here in New Jersey. That's a goal, right? We want to make sure people have easy access to the ballot. We want to address all of these things, and we want to go further. So we mentioned rights restoration. We did. It was huge victory. We're so proud of it. In 2019, December 2019, the governor signed a bill to restore voting rights to everyone on parole and probation. At that time, that was about 83,000 people who have the right to vote. But unfortunately, people who are currently incarcerated were left behind. They didn't have to be. They don't have to be. Maine and Vermont have never disenfranchised people who are currently in prison throughout their history. Maine and Vermont also happen to be demographically the two whitest states in the country. Because that's what this comes down to. I remember talking to someone from Maine there. It's someone who works at their NAACP during the campaign. And they said the reason why they think that's the case, why Maine has never had a big push to disenfranchise incarcerated people. If you look, their Secretary of State will go defend it. They are not even, it's not even something that's like undercover. They're hoping nobody notices. They're pretty proud of it. And this gentleman said it's because he thinks that people in Maine see folks who are incarcerated, people who get convicted of crimes, as their neighbors who did something wrong and are going away to serve out time. But at the end of the day, they're neighbors. That's the part that we never quite get to in states in New Jersey and other places. Why? Because the color of our skin comes into play. Why do the majority of people in New Jersey not feel that way? Well, maybe it's because New Jersey also has the worst disparities, white to Black disparities in incarceration in the country. A Black adult is 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white adult in New Jersey. A Black youth is over 16 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white youth, even though most of Black and white youth commit most crimes at similar rates. That's the system. And we by connecting the right to vote, we import all of that into our democracy. So one thing we look at now that we have an exciting gubernatorial race coming up, we have some momentum, is, hey, let's talk about it. Why can't people in prison vote? But let's talk about more. How do we broaden the franchise? How do we talk about, let's lower the voting age? So that's something that we're so excited about here. Newark just lowered the voting age to 16 for school board elections. Newark is the largest city in New Jersey. There are a number of cities across the country who have done this, started in Tacoma Park, Maryland. If you're curious, we can do it. The 26th Amendment is not a floor. It's not a bar. It just says that you can't we can't restrict the right to vote to anyone who is over 18. You can't abridge the right to vote who is anyone who's over 18, but it doesn't say anything for anyone under 18. We can do this. Similar language exists in the New Jersey Constitution. So we have this ability to do it, and recognizing that, we worked with this tremendous organization of young people, Vote 16 New Jersey. They're 16, 17-year-olds themselves. We've been working with the NAACP Youth and College chapter, who are so excited about this. And we said, hey, let's do this. And Newark did. Now we're working on implementing it. We have other cities who are interested. If you live in one, if you're connected to one and want to reach out, we're having lots of conversations to try to bring this. Let's pass this. And there's a state bill now. There is no reason that someone who's 16 shouldn't have the right to vote. There just isn't. There is the idea that one day you are not able, you do not have the faculties to vote, but the next day on your birthday you do, is just, it doesn't make any sense. Take a second and think about it. 16-year-olds in New Jersey pay taxes. They can serve as poll workers. You can serve as a poll worker, but you can't vote. It doesn't quite add up. So, and school board election, I mean, listen, if you ask me, they should vote in all elections, but we have some legalities at play here. School board elections don't make a lot of sense. They are the most affected by school board policies. So why not let them have a voice in the process, especially as, if you've been paying attention the last couple of years, so much attention is paid to schools and school boards. There are attacks on what they're learning about history, about Black history. There are attacks about what they're about LGBTQI rights. There are questions happening about climate change. They are concerned about the environment. They're concerned about safety and gun control. They have issues, and it's funny because often in this space we see, we've been watching now for over a decade, young people taking to the streets, young people having a voice, from Black Lives Matter to March for Our Lives to climate change. They are taking to the streets. And, I talk to folks and they're always like, they're so great. These young people, one day they're going to influence this democracy. One day they're going to take over and we'll be better for it. But why does it have to be one day? They have a voice, they care, they're exercising it. So let them use that voice in a way where they have real power. And we have the ability to do that. So that's why we're really excited about this. And we do have so much insight. There is a lot of passion behind it. We have young people who care deeply, but we're also seeing elected officials at a local level, state level, who are like, yeah, why can't they vote? This is not going to be easy. There's a lot of people who don't like it, but this is where we have to come in and push. We should also be talking about non-citizen voting. Let's go back to our roots in New Jersey. Why shouldn't they vote? Especially when there's a ton of precedent allowing them to vote. So I think often we need to be having this conversation. If we're going to be a leader in democracy, we can't just get to the status quo. We can't just be defending, because this is what it comes down to. So many states in this country are working to restrict the right to vote. So many states. So when you have in the country a bunch of states moving in one direction, restricting the right to vote, if the rest of us are just staying still, and the aggregate, you're still moving in one direction. In reality, the rest of us who really believe in democracy, who recognize it's important, should be moving in the other direction. We should be embracing it. We should be making a stand saying that here in New Jersey, one of the most diverse states in the country, we are on the cusp of becoming majority people of color. We are not afraid of democracy. We embrace it. So that should be the movement here. And I think we're getting there. We're on the precipice, and it's really exciting to be part of it. Both at the Institute and in partnership with so many folks here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Enel. I have to read our next CLE code. This code is 326987. It'll go in the chat as well, but I'll say it one more time. 326987. There's so much I want to dig into from all of your responses, but we also have great questions rolling in through the Q&A, and we have 8 minutes left. So I want to give our attention to our attendees. We've gotten 2 questions about sort of closed primaries. And so the question for the panelists, how do closed primaries, how do you think of them in the context of voting rights? Are they sort of a form of voter suppression? And in particular, in New Jersey, you have to declare a party affiliation in order to vote in a primary. How do you see that in the sort of context of our democracy and voting rights landscape?
I'll answer this quickly, at least a bit. I was recently doing GOTV on Saturday over Mother's Day weekend, and I was going door to door in an area that has a lot of Republican voters, and they wanted to participate in their, let me rephrase that. They were Republican voters on the national level, right? They believed in, you know, the current leadership of the GOP. Take it for what it's worth. But they wanted to participate in local elections and in the upcoming primary. And they're blocked from doing that. And they express they have a clear viewpoint in terms of who they would want to support. They know why, they're educated and informed voters, but they're not able to participate, right? Some of them told me, oh, I did put in a voter registration form to update my voter registration, to change my party affiliation. They missed the deadline for doing that because we don't have same-day registration to allow for that type of update in the system. And so then they couldn't participate in the primary, even though they're informed voters and they want to change, at least for on the local level, to participate. So, you know, on balance, yes, New Jersey, we have closed primaries, but there may be some good reasons to think about how to open and expand. And there's also other methodologies, right? Somebody put in the chat the availability of ranked choice voting. We're seeing great results in terms of ranked choice voting. We still have to continue to experiment and to monitor. But for example, in New York City, we had more women elected to the city council as a result of ranked choice voting. There's also a pending lawsuit now for fusion voting in the state to bring it in line with New York and Connecticut, which allows for some type of crossover. It allows for independent voices to be allowed on the ballot without just ceding affiliation to one party or another. And there's another effort that I just want to mention, because we're talking about state constitutionalism and opportunities in New Jersey, is there's a current litigation in New Jersey to ensure municipal democracy and prevent municipal redistricting and gerrymandering, especially in our urban communities. So there are a lot of positive options to expand and modernize and allow for these independent voters. Many voters in New Jersey actually find that they have more of an independent voice, but they're not provided with an avenue to express it. And that's why we get this kind of wonky, purpley thing where you had Chris Christie elected to the governorship, for example, Chris Christie passing finally the in-state tuition bill to ensure tuition equity for state-raised students who are otherwise be excluded, right? So we have this wonky political system because a lot of these independent voices are excluded, and we should be looking at modernized tools related to proportional representation and otherwise to embrace those voters and bring them into the fold.
Sorry, Liza, can I just add on to Liza's great answer? Because I think I was just looking at the questions. I think I can cover a few of them together. So to Yael's point, we do have a sort of closed primary, but I think there was a question about how to participate if you're an independent. I want to flag, if you're unaffiliated, which is actually, I think, what in other states folks think of as an independent voter, where you're not aligned with either the Democratic or Republican Party, you actually can vote in this primary up and through the day of election day. You just have to show up in person, pick which party you want to vote in, and they will give you a ballot. You will then be affiliated with that party. If you want to go back to being unaffiliated, you can fill it out. If you are registered as an independent, that might create some challenges. It is this third party, but they don't really have candidates. So you might not be able to vote in the primary, but reach out if you have questions and we can help you out. If you do want more information for the primary, which please share. I'm going to echo what the Secretary of State said, is it's on us to inform everybody else to make sure they participate. We have some information, njisj.org/vote. You can go there. Has a lot of voter information. You could go to the state's website, vote.nj.gov, where you can find your polling place, early voting locations, drop box locations, etc. They're all there. And if you're curious about if you have any races and you want to look at any of the candidates and connect to them, and we do actually, because of the line litigation, we actually have some actual competitive primaries, which is rare. I'm in one. I live in Hudson County. We never have one, but we do this year. It's interesting. Vote 411. Karen's. for the legal women voters. You can use your native. You can plug in your address and find information about candidates and stuff like that. So just wanted to please share with your networks.
Perfect follow-up, Pennell. Thank you. Very practical advice, which is just the way we want to close out here. I wish we could go on, but we've reached the end of our time. So I have to read the last CLE code, which is 998739. 998739. And then I have to give a huge thank you to this incredible panel. These are my legal heroes and role models and my favorite collaborators. I'm so grateful to all of you, and it's such an honor to have you here. Another big thank you to all the sponsors of this event. It's a really exciting annual event, and it's possible because of the generous sponsors. And lastly, tons of people on our team worked really hard to put this together. Folks on our legal team, you heard from Jean, but also on our development and comms teams, Diane and Sal, and Maya and Hannah and Mary, and Liz, and many more. Thank you, everyone. Please don't forget, if you're looking for CLE credit, to fill out your affirmation survey. And thank you. Be in touch with all of us as you are voting, as you're engaging in your democracy at the local, state, and national level. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you next year, but hopefully much sooner. Thanks, everyone.